Dissolved in acid, buried in bogs, consumed by pigs, or actually still alive? What happened to the missing bodies left behind by these notorious murderers? The case of the so-called diabolical pastor is a terrifying and disgusting one. As the story goes, Andras Pandy was born in the city of Chop on the Hungarian border before relocating to Belgium and working as a pastor in 1956. Around this time, he married Leonor. The couple had 3 children, and everything seemed normal until Sores and her 2 sons suddenly disappeared in 1967, leaving behind daughter Agnes. Andras remarried in 1979, this time to a woman named Edith Fintor, only for Fintor to also disappear around 1986. The truth didn't come out until 1997 when Agnes confessed. Despite his guise as a mild-mannered pastor, Andras was an incredibly controlling patriarch who began sexually abusing Agnes when she was only 13. She was forced into being her father's accomplice and confessed to being complicit in 5 murders: her mother, Leonor, her 2 biological brothers, and her stepmother, Edith Fintor, and daughter, Andrea. Investigators couldn't find the bodies. Agnes confessed to helping her father chop up those bodies to take them to the local slaughterhouse or dissolving them in a vat of acid. Regardless, the testimony was more than enough, even with the lengths Andras had gone to cover up his crimes. Agnes was given 21 years in prison, and he was given a life sentence. Andras died in prison in 2013. Still, several skeletons were found behind one of Pandy's homes, and both bone fragments and chunks of flesh were found in the flooded basement. None of them were confirmed to be the remains of the family, though, leading to the possibility of there being more victims. Joseph Marie Guillaume Seznec was a sawmill owner who took a trip from Brittany to Paris with a business partner named Pierre Camineur on May 25, 1923. The 2 were meeting Bujema Gertie regarding the sale of 100 Cadillacs, but their car started breaking down and Camineur elected to take a train. He reportedly sent a telegram from Le Havre and sent a bill of sale to Seznec for his estate, and then he was just gone. He was presumed dead, and Seznec became the prime suspect for his murder, with prosecutors claiming he'd made up Gertie as a cover story, and that Seznec sent the telegram to himself. Seznec was declared guilty and sent to a prison colony, but Seznec always claimed he was innocent, as has his family. They've long held that the incriminating bill of sale was fake, and that's not mentioning the fact that Gertie was real. During World War II, Gertie was an informant for Pierre Bonny, the investigator on Seznec's case who was kicked out of the police for falsifying evidence and later joined the French Gestapo. Shortly before his execution in 1945, Bonny apparently even confessed to sending an innocent man to a prison colony. In 2018, a fragment of bone was found on Seznec's former property, in conjunction with a confession that one of the children of the house had allegedly seen the victim dead on the ground. It implied that Camineur might have been killed by Seznec's wife, who was defending herself from his advances. Despite all that, though, French courts have repeatedly refused to reopen the case. The case of the Reykjavik Confessions began with the disappearance of Gudmundur Einarsson in a snowstorm in January 1974, somewhere in the rocky land of the Reykjanes Peninsula. People thought little of it until another disappearance that November, this time regarding Giovanni Brusca. Giovanni had disappeared under somewhat odd circumstances, having gone out to the peninsula to meet a mystery caller, then never returning. Police followed rumors that led them to small-time crook Sivert Ciesielski, and lengthy interrogations also brought 4 of Ciesielski's friends and girlfriend Urla Botladottir onto their radar. In the end, despite a lack of physical evidence, including a lack of bodies, all 6 of them confessed to both crimes. But this was far from a simple case. Those aforementioned interrogations lasted over the course of 8 months for some and years for others, during which all 6 were kept in solitary confinement, denied sleep, and physically tortured.
They formed a crack in my mind, and then they just got in there.
Reports from some of the accused revealed that many of them had foggy memories of what happened, most likely due to the drugs they were given supposedly to help them sleep, more likely to make them pliable. Eventually, all of them had either decided that a false confession was just the easiest way out, or had even been convinced that they had committed the murder. It wasn't until the 2010s when the courts officially recognized that their testimonies had been false and coerced through torture. Shirley Gibbs Russell was an accomplished captain in the United States Marine Corps with a bright future to come, but in March 1989, she suddenly disappeared from her apartment on the military base in Quantico, Virginia. Suspicions immediately turned toward her ex-husband, Robert Peter Russell, with the prevailing theory being that he shot her, then dumped her body in a mine. The only problem? There wasn't a shred of physical evidence to be found. No murder weapon, no bloodstains, and no body. Russell maintained his innocence, saying she'd wanted to leave her military life, disappearing entirely on her own. Witnesses later claimed to see her after the date of her disappearance. Fortunately for the prosecution, they had some interesting evidence, a supposed novel that Russell had been working on with his mother, in which a character kills the wife of a Marine. The manuscript ultimately outlined a 26-step murder plan, including details like make it look as if she left, and musings on how exactly to pull everything off.
The 26 steps was a very revealing piece of evidence because it showed the man's state of mind, his willingness to even contemplate murdering another human being.
Prosecution argued that it felt less like a piece of fiction and more like the notes for a real-life scheme. A witness testified to Russell confessing his murderous intent and ideas for a sneaky cover-up some months before, and in the end, Russell was convicted and Shirley Gibbs has not been found. The official statement regarding the 2004 disappearance of 8-year-old Joanna Cipriano from the small town of Figueira, Portugal, accuses Joanna's mother and uncle, Leonor and João Cipriano, of murder. It also involves the disposal of the evidence by cutting apart Joanna's body and feeding it to the pigs. Both Leonor and João were convicted for the crime and sentenced to prison. But the story doesn't end there. In 2007, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, who vanished from a town just 10 miles away from where Joanna was last seen, was all over the news. Once again, the parents were immediately blamed, despite a lack of real evidence, and that started turning heads. Both investigations were led by the same man, Gonçalo Amaral, who would eventually be kicked off the McCann case after it was discovered that he falsified evidence in the past. He covered up the use of torture to coerce a confession from Leonor Cipriano, who had come back from interrogations beaten and bruised. She would later retract her confessions, but to little effect. The methods called the Cipriano's convictions into question, leaving plenty of mystery surrounding both cases. Leonor was released from prison in 2019, and Joanna's body has not been found. 1992 saw the brutal murder of Giovanni Falcone, a Sicilian judge who was openly fighting against the presence and power of the mafia. Falcone was killed by the infamous Cosa Nostra, but law enforcement managed to get their hands on one of the mafia's assassins, Santino Di Matteo, who ultimately became a police informant. Turning against the mafia is a dangerous decision, something which became abundantly clear in 1993 when Di Matteo's 11-year-old son Giuseppe was approached by mafia members disguised as police officers. They offered to bring Giuseppe to his father, who was under police protection at the time. The kidnapping was intended to threaten Di Matteo out of testifying. They held Giuseppe for about 2 years, starving, beating, and generally torturing him, until Giovanni Brusca, a high-ranking mafia boss with the grisly nickname of the People Slayer, ordered the boy to be strangled to death. Brusca was eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison for that murder, as well as 26 years for the murder of Giovanni Falcone, a life sentence for an unrelated murder. He was released in 2021 after informing authorities of mafia activities. The story of Peter Reyn-Bardt and the disappearance of his wife came to a head with an accidental confession. Malika D. Fernandez and Peter Reyn-Bardt met in 1959, and after just 4 days, they were married. Things fizzled out just as quickly, though. Reyn-Bardt stayed back in England while Fernandez traveled the world, occasionally returning to visit Reyn-Bardt. Within a couple of years, Fernandez had disappeared. Police suspected Reyn-Bardt, but without any actual evidence, their investigation didn't get very far. The case went cold until 1983, when workers at a peat processing facility happened upon an odd shape that had been pulled from the bog near Reyn-Bardt's home.
2 of the peat cutters were working this trench along here when they dug up what they thought was possibly a dinosaur egg.
To their surprise, it was the head of a woman preserved by the bog's unique chemical environment. With initial reports saying that the head belonged to a woman between 30 and 50 years old, investigators immediately turned to Reyn-Bardt, who quickly confessed that he had accidentally killed Fernandez in 1960, after she threatened to blackmail him for being gay, which was a crime back in early 1960s England. After further analysis, investigators found that the head didn't belong to Fernandez. It belonged to a woman who died about 17 centuries earlier. Reyn-Bardt tried to take back his confession, but was still found guilty. Her body was never found despite multiple other bodies being unearthed in the area. Anthony John Allen was adept at weaving a web of lies. Allen's family mysteriously disappeared from England in May 1975, but according to Allen himself, he had fought with his wife Patricia Allen before she walked out on him, taking the kids with her to the US with a man named Johnny Simone. Her abandoned car was later found nearby, sparking suspicion, but without much evidence, investigators let the case go cold. The case was reopened in 2001 when some concerning details came to light. Allen had never been on the best terms with the law, having faked his own death in 1967 to dodge workplace theft charges. He was convicted for bigamy when he married his second wife before divorcing his first. Later, he was sentenced for burning mail that he was supposed to deliver. A bit of investigation into his wife's disappearance found that Johnny Simone had suffered a stroke in 1972. He couldn't possibly have helped Patricia. It was clear that Allen had lied, and the court couldn't see any reason for him to do so, other than as a cover-up for murder, leading to his conviction and a life sentence behind bars. The bodies have never been found, and Allen maintained his innocence until he died in prison in 2015. The story behind the conviction of John, Richard, and Joan Perry is more popularly known as the Campden Wonder. It starts with the elderly rent collector William Harrison, who left his home in Chipping Campden, England in August 1660. When he didn't return, his servant John Perry was sent to look for him. John was gone for a couple of days, after which Harrison's ripped and blood-stained clothing was discovered. Local authorities were suspicious of John, who suddenly started accusing his brother and mother, Richard and Joan, of robbing and killing Harrison, then dumping his body in a waterway. After searching the waterway, no body was found. After 2 separate court trials, all 3 Perrys were found guilty of murder and hanged in 1661. Richard and Joan always maintained their innocence, and John admitted that the story he'd told had been told while he was insane. Joan was executed first, just in case she was a witch. Then William Harrison showed up in 1662, alive and well. According to him, he'd been abducted and ended up forced into servitude in the Ottoman Empire. He made a daring escape by stowing away on a ship bound for England. Just how much of it was true is still a matter of debate.